Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a lot to cover in the next hour, so let's get started. So I'm going to cover some Photoshop techniques. I was also asked about modeling and UV unwrapping for this SKU. So I will go through the process of modeling, UVing, and texturing this. I just saw this SKU for the first time about 30 minutes ago, so let's see how far we get in 1 hour.
Đấy là không kịp nghe lắm, nhưng mà bạn ấy bảo cái này đang có vấn đề thì bạn ấy sẽ show lại cách bạn ấy dựng và cách bạn ấy tạo UV image để làm sao cho đẹp. Nhưng mà bạn ấy mới nhận được cái skill này và nhìn thấy nó lần đầu tiên cách đây 30 phút thôi. Thì giờ cùng nhau làm thử xem nó sẽ đến đến đâu. Vậy cũng chưa có thời gian nhiều như thế.
So the first thing I always do, that I think all of you do as well, is look for reference images. There's only really one on site here. It's nice and high resolution, but we only see maybe about a third of the vase.
Bước đầu tiên bạn thường làm là chắc là như mọi người là sẽ xem cái ảnh reference nó mà trong cái trường hợp này thì có mỗi một cái ảnh và nhìn thấy có một phần ở đấy trước rồi.
It does say the same print is around the vase, so we can assume that at least some of that will repeat, so we know we can use what we have for the rest of it. We're missing a few gaps that we'll have to fill in.
Và cái này là hình tròn và nó ở dưới nó biết là có thể là repeat, nên là mình giả định là cái mặt trước này nó sẽ repeat xung quanh, và sau đấy thì có một số phần ở giữa thì nó sẽ cần phải nó bị hở, thì mình sẽ tìm cách để mà điền thêm đến những cái thông tin và thông tin của trường.
So I save the reference image and then do a Google image search to find similar images.
Bạn đi xem ảnh xong rồi search bằng search ảnh Google tìm xem nó nào.
So I drag and drop here. I came up with a lot of different ones. So I've already opened these and looked through them and found some similar ones and saved them. But just to give you all the idea, I was able to find some other similar things. So we'll use these to fill in the parts of the texture that we're missing on ours. The shape is different, but the pattern is the same.
Bạn kiếm được một vài cái ảnh mà có một cái ảnh này một giữa một phần nó tương tự gần giống như là cái ảnh gốc của mình, thì bạn sẽ sử dụng những cái phần đó để mà fill vào cái phần mình thiếu trong cái ảnh reference của mình có.
I also found similar ones on Wayfair. I know when you are using similar models here, it only shows up if there's already a model for it. That one is close but not correct. We can still search on Wayfair, at least for photo and texture reference.
Ở trong cái mục CV image thì nó thể hiện lên những cái tương tự mà mình đã model rồi thôi, hay là trong trường này không có cái nào cả. Nhưng tuy nhiên mình cũng có thể lên Wayfair để tìm cái sản phẩm của ảnh tương tự thì bạn đã tìm được một cái có.
So this one is, it doesn't actually list the brand on here, but if we check the brand, or if we check the SKU on wayfair.com, we see this information here. So we can search for this brand for similar items.
Khi search skill ở trên Wayfair thì mình cũng tìm được cái thông tin của nhà bán, nên là vào trang nhà bán thì mình sẽ tìm được cái sản phẩm của bạn.
Category vases. The material was listed as porcelain. So we're lucky on this one, there were only 21 total, so it's pretty easy to find the similar products that we can grab additional reference photos from.
Nếu mà mình gặp may nên là mình phải lấy cái bài đó tương tự và nếu khách chưa được nào.
Any questions on that before I move to modeling? Good. All right. So this is the model that I was given. I'll comment on this really quick and then just kind of start on my own. I think the overall proportions on this look really good. The
Cái mà bạn ý được mọi người gửi cho thì bây giờ bạn sẽ comment cho mình một số cái tiến bệnh sau đấy bạn sẽ làm cái khác. Cái đầu tiên thì về mặt tỷ lệ là cái mình rất là làm rất là ổn.
the shape of the base looks good also. The nice ridges there. As far as the way the model is constructed, if I look at the UVs on this base shape beneath the smooth, I can see that it's planar mapped. There's a different way when we first start constructing from a primitive cylinder to get the UVs to be laid out better, and I'll show that in a minute.
Khi bạn kiểm tra thì thấy UV của mình đang bị cong, nó đang bị méo. Thì đây là cái cách setup của mình khi mà làm việc ở trên cái trụ khi mình tạo ra thôi. Bây giờ bạn sẽ show mình cái cách nó tối ưu hơn.
And when we use a shell modifier, unfortunately, this modifier causes some problems with UVs. The best way to fix it usually is to set our edge mapping down here to strip.
Khi dùng shell modifier như này nó sẽ làm cho cái UV bị hỏng. Cách để sửa đấy là vào cái edge mapping chọn cái strip.
And when I go through this myself, I'll show what that does and why.
Khi mà mình tự làm thì show cho mọi người cụ thể hơn là nó có ảnh hưởng như thế nào.
And this UV map here I see is a plane. So I can see the artist is projecting this texture onto the model. This was taken just from that one photo, which if that's the only photo we have, that's kind of all we can use. But obviously then that causes this stretching on the sides. So ideally we want a full unwrap and not a planar map so that we can get that better. And we should be able to do that when we have the full texture.
Đối với cái UV map này thì khi bạn đi check thì thấy cái bạn làm nhà mình là chỉ có dùng cái project trực tiếp cái ảnh crop từ trong kia nó ra thôi. Thì như vậy là nó sẽ không đầy đủ và nó sẽ tạo đấy nhìn bên cạnh cái là chúng ta thấy nó bị stretch, bị kéo dài và nó không đủ map. Thì cách làm là sẽ cần phải tạo cái vuông có đầy đủ thông tin và có thể bảo xung quanh cái sản phẩm này.
And then one more thing with this unwrap here that we're using to sort of fix the texture on these top surfaces, just make sure to fix the UVs beneath the smooth instead of above the smooth.
Và cái cách làm để cái unwrap cuối cùng kia để tạo cái phần cho cái cổ lọ thì cũng đang gặp vấn đề và để sửa nó và thường thường cái unwrap này cũng phải dưới troubleshoot giống theo cái tiêu chuẩn không đặt trên troubleshoot.
All right, so let's start modeling this from the beginning. We can check our dimensions on site. We're lucky that it gives us pretty good dimensions. We have the height, width, and depth, so we can put those numbers in here. So for the width being 6, our radius is 3. And the width and depth it's showing are slightly different. To start with, I'm going to make them both 6 so that this is a perfect circle. They're close enough that making it symmetrical at first will be much easier for me. And then once I get most of the way through it, I can change that.
Bây giờ bạn hãy coi như bạn làm thế nào. Và cái trong cái skill này thì nó đã đưa cho mình thông tin rất là rõ, nhưng mà có cái thông tin ở đấy là nó có chiều 6, chiều 5, chiều 5. Như là để mà làm việc cho nó dễ dàng, thì
So website says six and 5.5. I'm just going to make this 6 for now.
Website thì đã có hai trường là khác nhau, bây giờ bạn thì là cho cả hai trường là sau nó phải chọn
I'll change it once I get more done. So we have the opening width of 3 inches. So this is just my placeholder object. A radius is 1.5. So this is just so I know how wide it should be once I get there. And then same with the base of 5 by 5.5 for
cái thông tin về cái việc là 3 thì bạn tạo một cái trụ có bán kính là 1/5 dưới 5/5 thì tạo một cái ở phía dưới là 2/15, nhưng mà cái này sẽ là reference để biết là sau mình sẽ cho nó con nó ra.
So our radius, half of 5.5, will be 2.75. This height doesn't matter. This is not part of the model. It's a guide for me. So when I make a new object, I toggle both of these boxes on.
Tạo một vật thể mới thì bạn sẽ luôn bật hai cái đấy.
It makes it really big, but we have correct squares. The proportion is right. If this is off, it puts everything in here.
Thì cả hai thì cái tỷ lệ nó làm rất là chuẩn. Nếu mà không biết thì nó sẽ làm cho đấy có thể thấy nó
So I'll keep the default of 18 for now. I might change that as I'm modeling, but it's okay for now.
bây giờ thì tạm thời bạn cứ để cái số 3 là 18, sau này có thể thay đổi sao.
One thing I notice here is we sort of have these vertical stripes. I can't tell if that's the shape or just a reflection. I noticed the original modeler actually put those in the shape. For right now, I'm going to ignore them because it'll be easier to model without. I'll add them towards the end.
Như là trong cái ảnh reference thì trong cái bình này có mấy cái đường nó lôi lôi nhỏ nên ra kẹo thì bạn thì không dựa ảnh của bạn theo thì cá nhân thì không chắc chắn đấy là cái shape của cái vật hay là do cái ánh sáng nó tạo ra. Đối với cái bạn model làm ban đầu thì bạn đã model trực tiếp vào shape cũng ổn, nhưng mà với bạn thì bạn sẽ không model cái đấy luôn mà bạn sẽ làm các cái công việc khác và sẽ ép cái cong cong nhỏ cái đường cong nhỏ vào sau.
So I like to put the pivot point on the bottom. All right, so I'll add an edit poly and we can get started. So I'm just gonna eyeball the shape at first, and then I'll bring in the reference image to match it out more closely.
Bây giờ bạn nhìn vào hình này cho bạn nghĩ là sẽ cần thêm những cái gì vào còn tí nữa sẽ đem cái reference ở đây.
So this is just very approximate. I want to at least get it started. I'm not going to bother trying to preserve UVs as I'm modeling because it's going to change so much anyway. That initial UV was just to have something that was not awful.
Và cái bước này thì bạn sẽ không cần phải chưa cần phải tích vào cái preserve như là mình giữ cái
So the bottom is a little smaller than the top, and this pink one is my placeholder size for the bottom. Good enough. So now that I've done that, I can pretty much just delete this. Oh yeah, same with the opening here. We have this little, that width there, so I need this a little wider. All right, so let's bring in our reference image. So I'm going to open this in Photoshop and just check the dimensions. .2836. I'm using decimals, so it's not gigantic. Oops. Oh, it's because of that. There we go. So rotate 90 up here. X-ray is not really helping here. I can do this. Opacity. I'm blanking where it is. Someone point.
Còn nếu điều chỉnh opacity đâu thì các bạn quên rồi.
Whatever. I won't. I'll just do it this way. Object properties? Five? So you want someone to point? Thank you. Oh, but now I don't see the texture. I'll just approximate it. There we go. Thank you. So these won't match up perfectly because the photo obviously is taken in perspective. So I just want to get it close. And I want to match up with the sort of side extent points here. So it looks like my dimensions were kind of close, but a bit off. So I'm not going to do this super exact just for the sake of time. So I know these proportions are not perfect. I'll just pretend they are and move on. So the basic idea is to start as simple as possible and only add in exactly as much detail as I need. For now, I'm going to skip the base here. I think the question on this was more of the UVs and the texture on the body. So this, I think you all probably know how to do on the base. So basically, it's just a matter of getting the approximate shape correct and adding in the support edge loops and smoothing. So as I'm modeling, I add a lot of edit poly modifiers. That way, if I mess something up, I can go back to the previous version. Once I get past that part, though, I'll collapse it all down. So when you submit your models, we want them collapsed like this. But as you're working, having a few of these is okay. So here I just want to get the angle right around there. I've shown before I'm using show cage and show end result so that I can see the smooth version as I am editing the lower poly version. And I'm just using Swift Loop here to add edge loops. That one needs to be curved up a little. Oh, looks like I added two by accident. I'm just using a hotkey for Swift Loop here. Put a support loop there. Let's fix this bottom. I'll add one more. So I think overall it's a little too wide. If we look at the main width and height, or the main width and depth, the base is wider than this part. So when I made my main part that wide, that was a little too much. So that cylinder with a radius of 3, I'm going to duplicate that, make sure it's a copy and not an instance, call that base, and I'll just delete all those other things, make it much smaller and a different color so I can see it better, and put that up to 0. So that's how big my actual base will be. Make it a little higher, just pretty approximate. So now I can make this whole thing a little narrower. You can see that indent. So let's pretend that's correct so that we don't have to spend any more time on it. So if we need to edit how wide these curves are, can select the edge loop and move them up and down a little bit. I think this one billows out a little bit. So this isn't perfect. I'll call this good enough for now. I think you guys know how to fix it up from here. I want to show how we create the depth to it and how we do the UVs. So one last thing real quick. Around here where that corner is too tight, if we slide our edge loops down, it kind of starts pushing in there, which we don't want. So that's where I turn on edge constraint. If I slide that edge loop down, it stays along that same curve. So, good enough for now. So now that I have this, I don't really need the this version, so I will collapse this down. This is a simple enough shape that I can edit it if I need to. I don't need to go back to the original cylinder. So we make our models facing the front view, so I want my UV seam on the back, which it is. So I'm just going to fit this to the texture here. Since this will have to use a dedicated texture, since it's a pattern, it's not going to be tiling, so we want it within this square. I'll delete the bottom because we're not even going to see it and we'll fill it in later. And if we look at this right now, we can see that the texture is sort of stretched. The pattern is too high vertically compared to horizontal. I'm going to leave this for now until we apply the texture and see what it looks like. The benefit of this is that we have these very straight edge loops and edge rings. So if we need to paint a straight line on the texture, we can just follow along that line. If I were to unfold this properly right now, and I just have a hotkey for the relax tool. Now if we want to texture this, it's kind of hard to follow along these lines. So when I'm making things that are like this, that are these cylinder shapes that get wider and bigger, or wider and smaller, I'll keep it like this as long as I can until I see the texture on it. And I'll do this if I have to. Often what you'll end up doing, which I think the artist on here did, is breaking apart the different seams so that each one can be a little straighter or circular. But for now, I will leave it as it is. Okay, so I can collapse the UVs in. So let's do the shell modifier. We will want this to be the inner amount, since we already made the outer amount the correct width. 1 inch, that's way too big, maybe 0.2, that looks pretty good. So notice how if you use a shell at default settings and then unwrap it, it's gotten rid of all our UV seams around here. If I go to move by element mode, that one element has selected the inside and the outside, and it's added some weird triangles. And then we have these strips. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to correct what I just said. The UVs that I just showed were with the shell edge mapping set to strip. It had remembered the settings that I used the last time I added it. So we can see what it looks like with the different settings. If we do copy, that's the default where it just completely locks everything together inside and out and edges, which is definitely not what we want. None, it looks like, does pretty much the same thing. We also get these weird triangles. And then interpolate breaks it apart into two separate pieces, but the edges here are still attached. So we can try to break them apart and see if it works. Hit 2 for my UV edge selection. Break that off and select by element, and basically do that with the bottom as well. So now we have the inside and the outside, the bottom and the top. So we'll probably want the top and bottom to be circular. I'll leave it as it is for now because it's an easy layout to work with. I may change it later. And I'll collapse all this stuff down, even with a shell modifier. Oh, so I want that to be an edit poly. There we go. So even with a shell modifier, if I need to go back to the earlier version, it's pretty easy. All I need to do is select that edge loop, select that edge loop, control click polygon to convert that selection to polygons, delete. Now I can select my inner shell, delete. So if I need to, that'll get me back where I started. So I'll leave the shell on for now, but that's why I'm okay with collapsing it in. And we can see what it looks like smooth. Okay, so any questions on this before I make the texture? Okay. So I'm gonna launch, I have Photoshop launched. I'm actually gonna grab my my Wacom tablet. I forgot to connect it. I'm gonna pause the video and be right back.